All right. Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me all. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is 𝐂𝐻𝐡𝐢, and I'm the Director of Studies in Art History here at the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome, the KNIR. I'm also the coordinator of this new seminar series, the KNIR Research Dialogues, that we are launching today. And I'm delighted and excited that you are all here, such a big turnout for this first session. The idea of the research dialogues is that scholars who work on projects closely related to the research teams and areas of the Institute present work in progress and engage in stimulating and fruitful discussions or dialogues indeed with the audience. Now, due to the pandemic, we have to start our research dialogues, of course, online, but we hope to be able to move to a hybrid format with a live speaker and a live audience in the Institute and a live video transmission in the not too distant future. So today is the first of 6 sessions that we have planned until the summer. And I think we have a very interesting program this semester. So I invite everyone to check out also upcoming sessions on our website and to subscribe to our newsletter if you have not already done so. A couple of practical issues. So you see that we have turned off everyone's cameras. This will be the case until, for the duration of the presentation. Afterwards, after the presentation, for the moment that you can ask questions, the question and answers part, you can turn on your cameras and your microphones again, and we also encourage you to do so. And in order to raise a question, please do so by raising a hand, which you can find in the reactions part in the lower bar of the screen. So now I would like to give the word to our Director of Studies in Ancient History and Archaeology, and also our acting scientific director, Dr. Tesse Stek, who will introduce our speaker and moderate this session. Tesse, I give the word to you.
Thank you, Matthijs. Indeed, we are very happy to welcome Peter van Dommelen as the first speaker in our brand new series. Actually, Peter was supposed to join us at the Institute as a visiting professor in spring, but of course, for reasons that we all know about, this hasn't been possible. But at least we now have him, and indeed as the first speaker in our series. So in a way, he is present at the Dutch Institute anyway. Peter van Dommelen is a famous Mediterranean archaeologist, has worked a lot on the Western Mediterranean and Sardinia in particular, and mostly in a very long-term perspective. So indeed from Bronze Age up to the Roman times, revealing interesting patterns of interaction, often colonial interactions, but even up to modern times, especially for his perspectives on the ancient world from a rural point of view, which actually all comes together in his publications. So these revolve mostly about colonialism, material culture, and rural landscapes, both in the past and in the present. Peter studied archaeology and classics at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, where he specialized in theoretical and classical archaeology, which in that time was not that a logical combination. He finished his work on with his PhD on colonial grounds, and then soon moved to Scotland, where he became a professor at the University of Glasgow between 1997 and 2012, where I had the honor to visit him as a postdoc in that time. Afterwards, he moved on even further to the west, now ended up in Providence, Brown University, where he's director of the 𝐒'𝐿𝐴 Institute. And he is normally in non-pandemic conditions traveling a lot, and has also been visiting professor in various places in the Mediterranean, in the Western Mediterranean, such as the University of Valencia in Cagliari, and in the Balearics on Mallorca. So today we have a talk in which indeed colonialism, material culture, and rural landscapes come together. Yeah, I'm looking very much forward to his presentation about the nuraghe, colonialism, and rural exploitation. So I give the word to Peter now.
Thank you very much, Tessa, for a generous introduction. I'll begin by sharing my screen so everybody can see the presentation. Does that work? Has that come through? Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the confirmation, because I wouldn't want to start speaking without people seeing. Good. Thank you very much. I want to begin really by thanking the Dutch Institute, and in particular Tessa again, for the invitation to give what is this inaugural lecture of the new research series, as you've just heard. And I'm sorry, and I guess that sorry includes also I'm sorry for myself, not to be able to travel to Rome and to be at the 𝐍𝐮𝐫𝐚𝐴 for this talk and a longer research stay at the Institute. But even so, I'm glad and it's a pleasure that I'm able to contribute to the intellectual life of the Institute, even if it's from a distance, oltreoceano, as it is the case. So my talk tonight is straightforward, I hope. I will first of all be speaking about a specific nuraghe called Suraki, and about the excavations there that I've been co-directing since 2013 with my colleague Alfonso Stieglitz. But at the same time, this nuraghe and those excavations are a pretext to talk about two much broader topics, namely ancient colonialism and rural organization. But let's begin by talking about a nuraghe. What is a nuraghe? Prehistoric monument, or nuraghi, or nuraghis, as they're called in Sardinian, they are prehistoric monuments that are presumed, widely presumed, to have been built in the Bronze Age. So let's put it very roughly, not to put too finely a point on it, 2nd millennium BCE. But after the Bronze Age and after the Iron Age, or at least part of the Iron Age, these nuraghi didn't disappear from the island. They just stay there. There's still 7,000 of them, and you in fact are looking at a very nice one of them. And it is these later phases of the nuraghi that have received scant attention, even though we're talking about 3 millennia of history, 1st millennium BCE and the 2 millennia CE. Today though, well, today I will be speaking about one of these millennia, the 1st millennium BCE. And it's actually also from this period that we know that the term nuraghe itself is ancient. There's one nuraghe called 𝐼 which has a much late, well, sort of a 1st millennium, say 1st century more or less, inscription on it that mentions the word nuraghe, which is the oldest attestation of the word nuraghe, of what became nuraghe. These settlement towers, these nuraghi, are obviously very, very different. They stand in very clear contrast to so-called colonial settlements. And here you see a very nice one, Taros, Phoenician settlement, later Carthaginian settlement. And even although most of this, the archaeology that you see there is Roman. It is sites like these so-called colonial sites, that are usually investigated to say more about Phoenician and about Carthaginian, about Phoenician expansion, about Carthaginian domination, that is the colonial rule over the island of Sardinia. And at this point, I should actually also situate you chronologically. We're talking here for the Phoenician presence, so say roughly 8th, 7th century BCE, and Carthaginian rule sort of starts from the later 6th century CE. So it's most of all the sort of the first half of the 1st millennium that I'll initially be speaking about, but sort of then switching to the later part as well. Coming back to these colonial settlements, these are exclusively Phoenician and later Carthaginian settlements without any clear evidence of local or indigenous communities. In this photo, you'd really need to go to the top of the photo to see anything indigenous or local. And even although it is common practice throughout the Mediterranean and elsewhere to just look at colonial settlements, at colonies, if we want to understand colonialism, that is, in a way, if you think about it, sort of somewhat paradoxical, if not contradictory. If you want to understand Phoenician commercial relations or Carthaginian colonial rule, you surely need to understand a little bit about the other side, the people Phoenicians were trading with, or those who the Carthaginians were exploiting. The usual answer is that these colonies are the places where the evidence is to be found. But that is, of course, at least I argue, a self-perpetuating fallacy. Because if you don't look for the evidence anywhere else, you're never going to find it anywhere else. And that is, of course, precisely what we are trying to do, looking somewhere else. That is precisely what we want to do with the Progetto 𝐒'Zuraki, the 𝐒'Zuraki project. Here you see nuraghe 𝐒'Zuraki, where Alfonso Stiglitz and I started the Progetto 𝐒'Zuraki, as I said, in 2013. The key reasons for selecting this site to work are the deep local roots of this site, which is basically the nuraghe itself. That, as I said, we presume it has a Bronze Age foundation. Don't really know, but that's what we have reasonable reason to assume. And because of the multiple external connections that were already known from this site, and we thought, and we still think, that that gives us a good perspective and a good place from which to begin to understand colonial relationships. Right, and I was forgetting my, and so these are then, well, first of all, a sketch that gives you an impression of what the nuraghe might have looked like. The remains that you still see in the field are impressive enough, but as you can see from this sketch, would have been substantially more impressive had you seen the real thing. And there you see the aims of our project, looking at cultural connections, colonial entanglements, rural life, and indigenous perspectives. But let's begin to say a few words about these Mediterranean wider connections. Just sort of as a quick example, the item you see here is a so-called torch holder or incense burner. Thymiaterion is a technical term that would be of 8th, 7th century date, and that sort of most likely comes from Cyprus. It's also most probably was found at 𝐒'Zuraki. It's an antiquarian find, so the precise find circumstances are not known, but so that's quite well associated with 𝐒'Zuraki, and it's therefore it's a rare thing to find, and that says something. It's also quite a bit of Phoenician pottery had been found over the years in the vicinity of the nuraghe, and these elements, these were for us a sort of main reason to sort of go and work at 𝐒'Zuraki. But our decision to work at an indigenous site for understanding external context and especially the impact of colonial rule in general was inspired and guided by post-colonial theory, because Western scholarship, including archaeology, has long been dominated by a colonizer's perspective, and all too often that remains the case. Post-colonial debates have also taught us that these representations are not accidental, and we actually see an example here in this scene, which was photographed in central Algeria. We see the French Foreign Legion troops marching through the gate of a Roman military camp as if it were a triumphal arch. And this is 1958, in the middle of the Algerian War of Independence. Our perspectives, therefore, are not neutral, far from, and we have therefore taken the conscious decision to highlight the colonized experience in our research at 𝐒'Zuraki in Sardinia. And this nicely coincides with the neglect of that later phase of occupation in nuraghe in general. And as we will see later, this Algerian example that I show you here is by no means unique or an extreme one, because politics and archaeology remain closely intertwined, including in Europe and the Mediterranean and Italy and Sardinia. But first of all, let's take a closer look at our study region on the central west coast of the island of Sardinia. There's several colonial establishments here. There's a host, and just some of the better known ones are indicated here. Several indigenous sites on here, but it's the three sites highlighted in red that I will be speaking about, touching on. I've said already a little bit about Taros, you see at the bottom. The top site is Nuraghi, you see their relationship. And in the middle between those two is a site called Monte Prama. And that's where I want to start. So Monte Prama is a site that's sort of probably fairly well known by now, at least by fame. So let me give you the basics about it. So the basics are a burial site, a cemetery, really, that dates to the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. So the turn of the second millennium, 10th, perhaps 11th century, going down into the first millennium, coming down to the 8th century BCE or so. It is a unique site because Iron Age burials are practically unknown on the island. Outside Monte Prama, or before, if you take away Monte Prama, we know less than a dozen burials, well, actually less than half a dozen burials of Iron Age date would be known. So it's important, therefore, and it's unique in that perspective, in that sense. As you can see at the lower corner, the burials are single inhumations, and that also is a sharp contrast to the Bronze Age burials, which were communal burials in a large megalithic tomb, the so-called tomba di giganti. And so that's about as different as you can get as well. And as you see on the aerial photo and on the excavation photo at the bottom as well, the linear layout of the tombs is quite remarkable. But I want to emphasize that that is a feature of the latest phase of the 8th century. That's the one I'll be talking about more. But the earlier burials are concentrated in various small concentrations, sort of around, not far off from this linear alignment, but it did not begin as a linear alignment. The site, of course, is best known, famous, infamous, if you want, for its statues. 27 statues have now been identified from tens of thousands of stone fragments. These statues are life-size, over life-size, a little bit over life-size, in fact, and they're made of local stone. Iconographically, they're based on contemporary nuraghic iconography of small statues. I'll show you one in a minute. Where these statues stood is entirely unknown. We have really no idea about that because they were found totally fragmented, messed up, mashed up, smashed up, and the fragments spread out all over around these tombs. There is a spatial association between these broken up remains and the tombs, so they would not have been too far off from these tombs. And it is probably a reasonable assumption to assume that they would have been lined up in a long line alongside these tombs, especially because, and you can just about see it in this photo and follow it on the map, actually. On the map, sort of Monte Prama here, there was a road running right here, sort of at the foot of the hills, coming from Taros below here and going up to the Campidano di Milis up in the north, where Nuraghi is. And that road would have been sort of roughly sort of this part on the black and white photo. And so to think that these statues would have been somewhere here near these tombs or so, that's, you know, that's a reasonable assumption, but it's not more than that. It's an assumption. We have no idea. What we do know, and what's pretty obvious when you look at these, is that this is all about display, about marking a presence, about power, marking out power. And again, in this context, it's important to keep in mind the location on this road coming up from Taros, connecting up to the Campidano of Milis. The statues represent warriors and miniature nuraghi. And the latter, the miniature nuraghi, are an well-known Iron Age symbol of power. These miniatures are known from elsewhere, from other sites on the island, on Sardinia. You know, and, well, they're well known in Sardinia, that is. The statues, they're unique in their size and in the use of the material, the stone. more or less unique, but not in the iconography. And can you see that from the little bronzetto, the little 20 centimeter, 25 centimeter high bronze statuette. As I said, they mostly represent warriors of various types. So the site and the display is unique, but the individual features that are being used at, that are being repurposed really, they're not unique. They are known from elsewhere. So this site, the whole setup, clearly roots in a nuragic tradition. There's no doubt about that. There's also no doubt, I think, about that this site is all about elites and about ancestors. That's the combination of this display, the statues, and the burials. And so Carlo Tronchetti has proposed to think about it in terms of a heroon. Yeah, and that would be sort of a good way of thinking about it. But it's really this dual purpose, making a mark, propaganda, affirming power. That is what this site was about. These statues, they've drawn all attention. And in doing so, they also confirm the post-colonial critique that I mentioned earlier, as these statues have become, over 10 years ago, the subject of extensive misinformation and even more ingenious complot theories. Fake news, really, we call it today. As well of, and this is significant, as well of they've become the object of active regional government politics. They've been actively used, they are actively being used to promote regional nationalism. And that nationalism goes hand in hand with the exotization and the orientalization of Phoenicians, as you can see in the upper right corner. And it's significant that both these initiatives, the exotic representations of the Phoenicians and the emphasis 𝑁'𝐴𝐴𝐻𝐴, that both are initiatives led by the regional island government. But this is not the topic of my talk today. That could easily be, it would be a very interesting topic in its own right, but that's not what I'm speaking about today. But I do want to mention it because of the post-colonial relevance, and also because it has direct, inevitable, and inherent implications for all the work that I do and that I'm speaking about today. One effect, in fact, has been the frequent comments that we get at our project when working at 𝐒𝐫𝐴, because we are finding Phoenician and Carthaginian material, or finding Phoenicians, as people say, and finding Phoenicians at a nuraghe is wrong in this nativist perspective. And we get that told in no uncertain terms quite frequently. Another effect of this narrow focus on just the statues, has been the total neglect of the wider region and context. Although that wider region and context is in fact remarkably rich in Iron Age remains, constitutes a fairly rich Iron Age landscape. And this is not just about a lack of interest, but also a lack of funds, because while huge sums of money are being poured into those statues, a new museum was built, or a new wing to a museum was built in just 2 years at Cabras. When was the last time that happened? And I should also add, though, Taros also gets a fair bit of attention still, but it's invariably depicted as the exotic other. And well, I guess the secondary reason is it attracts tourists as well. But the reality of all of this is that neither Taros nor Monte Prama existed in isolation. And let's therefore go and look at that landscape in a little more detail. And of course, the place where I do want to look at that landscape in more detail is at 𝐒𝐫𝐴. And here you see 𝐒𝐫𝐴 from a wonderful drone photograph made by Fabio Pina. Work at 𝐒𝐫𝐴 started here in 2013, funded by Brown University and the Comune di San Veromiglis. And I should also acknowledge here, I want to acknowledge here, the support that we received from the Loeb Foundation at Harvard University and from the National Geographic Society. We don't know all that much about the nuraghe itself, which sort of occupies this sort of upper part here. But what we can see very well is the antemurale, and you see where I indicated here, the antemurale, an outer defensive wall, and remember the term antemurale, which has a series of towers. You see a bunch of them here. In total, there were 10 towers. And we can see these so well today because they were excavated in 1948 by Giovanni Liliu. He sort of removed all the deposits sort of on the outer side here and made them visible. And as you can also see here on this slide, our excavations are outside the nuraghe, outside the antemurale. And you can see that even better here on this plan. As archaeologists, we must have a plan of our excavations, and here you see one. 3 areas, as you see, D, E, and F. Work in E is complete, work in D continues, and F was started fairly recently, 2018. So let's begin by taking a look at area E, where in area E we were able to dig down to the basis of the tower and the antemurale, and you see that here, very heavy, foundation, these lower courses of the wall, and this sort of foundation reinforcement that was built here. Beyond that, we also found lots of constructions debris that was from the construction of the walls, the upper parts of the walls itself that was there. And that was all mixed with a lot of pottery, both nuragic and Phoenician pottery. And the diagnostic fragments, which were, well, a fair amount, a good 100+ fragments or so, nuragic and Phoenician, plus several C14 dates, demonstrate that this tower and antemurale were built in the early part of the first half of the 7th century BCE. That is unusual because these antemurali are usually assumed to be older, much older by some. But to be fair, not all that many of these antemurali have been well dated. Even so, there are a couple for which some evidence is available, especially Villanova Foru and Barumuni, for those of you who are more familiar. And those are probably more likely to have been built in the 9th century or so. And I also, as I said, I mentioned some colleagues assume that these things are sort of much older here. And I definitely do not want to claim that with this date, all antemurali are so young. But the evidence we have, pottery, stratigraphy, C14, will leave no doubt that this antemurale was built in the earlier part of the 7th century BCE. And Suraki is in any case sort of an unusual instance, an unusual case, because the antemurale doesn't stand on its own. You can see that here, you can see the reinforcement, the bases here again, but there's also all of this here. And what all of this here is in addition to the tower and the wall here, there's also a ditch in front of the wall. The ditch is clearly related to it. It was stratigraphically connected to it. It was built in one go as part of a single project of defensive architecture. And it's, as you can see on the photo and on the section, it has 2 stone-built embankments. There's no parallel for this at all in Sardinia, but we know similar ditches in the Phoenician world, both in the Levant and in Spain. And the 7th century date for this would fit pretty well with that, but at the same time, it is equally important to remember, and I will emphasize that right now, that the architectural style and the techniques of both the wall, the antemurale, and of the embankments of the ditch are 100% nuragic in style and execution. But there was more going on at the nuraghe, and here we're switching to area D, the other excavation area, and it's also going back in time of the excavation. You can see that the photo is an aerial from 2017. Let me begin to orient you. So this is the antemurale, roughly, the antemurale, 3 towers. And basically what we found in this area is a lot of messing around with the nuraghe, a lot of additional expansion and transformation of the spaces here. And these three phases cover more or less most of all of the first millennium BCE. But I'll be speaking now, I want to concentrate on the blue one at the top, the wall there. The other two I'll come back to later on. So this is a closer look a few years on after excavation. So you see this here at the top is the tower, and this is that blue wall, let me call it that way, the extension wall coming down with most of all over here, indicated by the ranging pole, a clear, fairly sizable doorway, and inside you see this neat cobblestone flooring, which we interpret as indicative of an open air space on this side of the wall, and we sort of refer to this, think of this space here as a courtyard. What's notable and interesting is you see the pot on the screen here, which is a Phoenician tripod bowl. There were three in fact, found of these, sitting right on this floor. And these are late 7th century items. And what you could also see on my plan, what you can see on this photo as well, this wall, the so-called blue wall, abuts the nuraghe tower, so it's a later extension of it. And so there's a lot happening in this 7th century here. Sort of early in the 7th century, the tower and the antemurale are built, and sort of within some time after that, we can't, because we haven't finished excavating here, can't quite pinpoint that. This extension wall is built with a new courtyard with additional space. A little bit sort of later, sometime later in that 7th century. And what this space, this expansion does, it sort of extends the nuraghe, because, where's my cursor here? Because it connects to this access door into the nuraghe ignore the wall on the side here, which is later, but sort of this floor level corresponds to the cobble courtyard floor that I showed you earlier. And so clearly, this is the doorway in the antemurale. So this is the antemurale, this is a doorway through it. And so at the time when that blue wall was built, creating this extra courtyard against the antemurale, that was also sort of, it just was an extra space before getting into the nuraghe. It just changed the use of space, different circulation through and around the nuraghe. All of this in the 7th century BCE. So all of this so far, I've been talking architecture, which is kind of inevitable when you're dealing with a nuraghe, and I'm sure this will have delighted some people here, I hope. But in order to sort of really understand and to get a better understanding of what's going on, we'll need to leave the architecture a little bit for what it is and look at portable material culture artifacts. And so, because these really help us to fill out the picture. To get to those, we return here to area E, earlier in the excavation as well, and look at the ditch from another angle. So just to orient you, the nuraghe is to our right over here. Because in fact, what is the case here, the ditch began to be used as a dump in the late 7th century, towards the end of the 7th century, and especially in the 6th century, the whole ditch was pretty quickly backfilled with a lot of trash dumped into it. And so here you see a reconstruction view of it, the antemurale with the ditch in front of it, and somebody already throwing some stuff in it, but actually it was more than just a bucket of water that was being thrown into it, because it began with tons and tons and tons of pottery. And also significantly around this time, Phoenician pottery was becoming dominant. At the time of the building, as I said, the pottery that's associated with the construction of the nuraghe, there was Phoenician pottery, but most of it is Iron Age nuragic. But by the time the backfilling begins, it's really Phoenician style pottery becomes dominant. Although I should add, locally made Phoenician pottery. But not just pottery, tons and tons of bone. So, well, we had 1,300 kilos of pottery we collected there, just to give you the numbers, but also tons of animal bones, 300 kilos, 35,000 fragments. And you see one table of it over here. All these animal bones, they have cut marks. Well, not all of them, but a lot of them have cut marks, which confirms that these are food remains and that the whole dump into that ditch is just domestic trash. People are throwing away their household garbage into the ditch. Equally important, and that's the other side of the slide here, and really this is where we just hit the jackpot. We just got lucky excavating here. This area is very wet because the local water table is very high, which has led to an amazing preservation of organic material, of wood, but also and especially of seeds and fruits. And in fact, on the photo, you see our paleobotanist, 𝐿'𝐵𝐻 from Valencia, and you see his smile, although he's standing knee deep in mud water. This find is important, not just because it's unusual, but also because it shows new crops that are commonly associated with Phoenicians. And I just show you here figs, pomegranate we found as well, melon, and grape. Although sort of whether grape was introduced by Phoenicians is a different question here, but which I don't go into now. But it is imports, when we're talking imports here, is not just pottery, it's also crops and probably even animals. And so putting all this together, we can start to think about interactions, a whole series of interesting, fascinating interactions in this period of the 7th and 6th century BCE, based on the architecture, the faunal evidence, the botanic evidence, and tens of thousands of ceramic fragments. First of all, we see imports from elsewhere in the West Mediterranean. Here you see on the photo a really nice so-called East Ionian cup. In this case, that's very likely to be an Etruscan import. At the same time, this period, on the other photo, where you see some more imports. At the bottom, you see a very distinctive nuraghic style handle, with the majority of these whitish ceramic fragments. This is all Phoenician style pottery, all of it locally produced. But also we have, and that's the distribution of the animal bones. You see there was a fair amount of sheep, goat that was consumed, as is to be expected, but there's an unusually large percentage of cattle there. And since that we have established that these bones represent food remains, really what we're looking at is these people liked their beef. And that is interesting because it's very unusual in the Phoenician Punic world, whereas it sort of really chimes nicely with the importance of cattle in the nuraghic world, in nuraghic context. The prevalence, the importance of cattle becomes a little less through time, but it always remains significant. So what does all this tell us? What was happening at this nuraghe? What was happening with this nuraghe throughout this time? What we're really looking at is a period of relatively rapid change, but with important and with major continuities. 7th into the 6th century BCE. So archaic period, Iron Age, late Iron Age, archaic period, if you want to, those conventional chronological labels. So what we see is adoption of new pottery styles, but with continuities in some aspects. So the clay is used as a local clay. So it's the same clay that was used before, although other new clays are being used as well. There's certain technical details that continue. Cooking pots tend to be locally produced in a local clay. There's a creation of new pottery types. And this bowl here on the left is interesting. The shape with the carena is typically Phoenician in appearance, so is the red color, the red slip. And in fact, this is also in a new fabric. But what's unusual is the size, and there's no scale with it, so I'll tell you that the thing is about 70 to 80 centimeters across. So in terms of functionality, this is much more like a very large nuraghic plate or dish, the so-called 𝐒'𝐫𝐚𝐿. But you know, it sort of, apart from the size and the fact that it's round and sort of sort of shallowish, but with a little bit of a rim. Otherwise, it doesn't really look like a nuraghic 𝐒'𝐫𝐚𝐿, but it does fulfill that same function. The nuraghe itself has this innovative ditch that I spoke about, but it was very quickly backfilled. So it really wasn't in function for a long time, although it remained visible for a long time afterwards. Sort of, we can pretty clearly see that for at least for another 100 years, probably more, it remained just a wet, muddy spot, particularly in the winter, where people continued to dump all sorts of trash for time to come. At the same time, the nuraghe remained in use. It had that extra wing built to it that I spoke about. And the community living here is very well connected, including beyond the island. And then finally, this miniature nuraghe, which comes from a nearby site, sort of another 10 kilometers away or so, called 𝐶𝐮𝐫𝐻𝐻𝐿. It is perhaps typical of all that's going on. It's the miniature nuraghe that reminds us of Monte Prama. It's this elite symbol of power, but it has a figure attached to it, two figures attached to it. There's a sort of an animal and a person, which is sort of pretty innovative, not entirely new, but yeah. And so it's these innovations tacked on to existing traditions that is really the sort of leitmotif that we are seeing here all the time for this 7th, 6th century. So let's move on in time and let's look a little bit later. What next? So what happened after the 6th century, which is when, at least according to our historical sources, Carthage took over and the island of Sardinia came under Carthaginian rule. And Carthage became the dominant power throughout the West Mediterranean. So for that, we take a look at our area F at the top of the photo here, and you can see a first glimpse of it there. And what stands out immediately are those sort of really straight walls here. Oh, and I should actually mention at this point, I didn't speak about houses for our previous earlier phases, those 7th, 6th century, because we have the trash, the garbage that those people threw out into the ditch, but we don't know where they live. So far, we haven't found traces. We have some evidence from test pitting that, well, it is maybe a meter down, so we haven't gotten there yet, and so we'll hope to get there. But we assume on sort of parallels from elsewhere that those houses would have been rounded or elliptical, so certainly not straight as these ones are here. And so here you see, as we left the excavation in 2019, and with the plan there as well, so there's a lot more to be excavated. We obviously didn't go back last year to 20, and we won't be going back this summer for excavating either. But still, we can begin to see the multiple building phases to begin with, and certainly a complex multi-roomed building with indications, with some evidence for a second floor of it as well. And so the small stones and the mud brick that we found show clearly that we're not dealing with nuraghic architecture. And the long and narrow rooms that we can see are also typically Phoenician Punic. And actually a great parallel you see in the corner there, which is from a site called Paniloria in the south of Sardinia, a Punic, Phoenician Punic settlement, 5th century. This data is here. And that matches nicely our provisional chronology for this area F, for what we see here, 5th, 4th century BCE. One of the test pits that we dug, not just outside this current area F, shows that same, confirms this picture, shows the same thing. A straight wall that you see here, but especially 2 lime floors, lime plaster floors, which are highly unusual to find in association with the nuraghe, this sort of settlement. But these floors, these straight walls, these buildings, these would be sort of pretty normal Punic houses in Nora, in Taros, or Sant'Antioco in a Carthaginian settlement. They're not normal at the nuraghic site. And the finds, as far as we have them, and so this is all pretty preliminary, but they show sort of a well-connected, well-to-do local households, nicely made pottery decorated. You see there stamped material, and also sort of a fair amount of amphorae, more than we had in the earlier phases in dumps. And this is an impression of what it would have been like. So you see here the two in the foreground, the two Punic houses. As you can see, sort of more complex buildings, but the nuraghe still intact. At that time, the doorway is still functional and accessible. Still accessible and functional. Okay, sorry. So the sorry, I was just getting my apropos here. This reconstruction sums it up nicely. Yeah, what we see here is what, you know, at first sight you see, wow, there's quite a contrast, the nuraghe and these houses, but at the same time these are functioning together. The nuraghe was accessible, was being accessed at the time, and so I think this contrast is more apparent than real. What we see is a thriving community that seems to found its way in the changing wider world around here. Okay. If we look back to area D, that's the area where we looked at the blue wall already, which is not blue in this drawing, and where there were other later structures, and those later structures I want to highlight now. I want to, so if I've indicated the antemurale here, I just want to make the, I should note here that the two towers that seem to be a very different size, they are the same size. This is just an early drone photo that had with a camera that was not great at the perspective. So this is the antemurale, and these are the two buildings that we found, and they're kind of significant because we see that the courtyard here, this is the courtyard underneath here, the courtyard gets built over by this room here that's sort of built against the antemurale over here, and this actually indicates that at a later time in the sort of 2nd century we are by now, this tower had collapsed and this building was built, partially built over the remains of that tower. But most of all, we're looking at fairly small buildings, single-roomed buildings, sort of much smaller affairs than we have seen so far. And you know, this is here an artist's impression of it. This is an impression of what it might have looked like. And striking here is the contrast between the multi-roomed and the multi-floor houses of area F and these much smaller buildings. And you know, if anything, they're more modest, but it's just very different. For the later ones, it also seems that amphorae are a much more prominent part of the assemblage here, but you know, we're still working on those. But my suggestion is here, as you can see, that we may think of these changes from that there's a process of ruralization, a move away from nucleated and thriving settlement to these much more sort of modest houses. The evidence at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻𝐸 is only at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻𝐸, of course, and there's much more to be said. It's far from conclusive, and at the least we need some more corroboration. And my argument is that this process at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻𝐸 is part of the creation of much of a distinctively rural landscape across a much larger part of Sardinia, at least in the sort of western central part. And therefore, I'm going to move a little bit south, going down the Gulf of Oristano, as you can see on the map, to the Terre district for some comparative material. In this Terre district, I've had the pleasure and privilege to co-direct, together with Carlos Gómez-Bellar of the University of Valencia, a 10-year program of survey and excavation of Punic period single farmsteads, all of which were new foundations, entirely Punic in architecture and portable material culture. You're looking at the remains, the rubbed out foundation trenches of one of them. This particular one, we were able to distinguish two building phases, a 4th, 3rd century. You see that in the reconstruction, a 4th, 3rd century phase, sort of a few buildings grouped around the courtyard, and a much more impressive 2nd century 2-floor, 2-story building with a sort of an outer wall around it, a fairly impressive building, as you can see there. And the sort of impression of being well off is confirmed by the portable material culture. Coinage was circulating, figurative pottery was imported from elsewhere, lots of amphorae were imported from elsewhere. These are products from Carthage in North Africa. And a lot of amphorae and cooking pots were produced locally. So especially a lot of amphorae were produced locally that make up 40 to 50% of the assemblage, and which therefore presupposes some sort of agrarian produce. At another site we excavated nearby here, 𝐒'𝐴𝐻, we got a good idea of what kind of produce this might have been here: wine. Because we found a grape processing wine production plant here that produced sizable quantities of wine well beyond the household's own needs here. The date is not totally clear, but we're somewhere in the 3rd, 2nd century BCE here. These are the only 2 farms excavated, but from surface evidence from other parts, we can it's clear that the evidence here at 𝐒'𝐴𝐻 is not exceptional. And I'll just to explain quickly what you're looking at. These are the 2 lower basins that are these sunk into the ground collection basins that received grape juices for grapes that were trampled in this upper basin here that's been lost in this case. And these are part of the plaster and construction. And we in fact also found 2 pruning sickles and lots of botanic evidence of grape pips and so on around here. So this clearly was producing wine. These 2 farms give us a detail of what is a bigger picture here. In the Terre area, we have a lot of evidence from extensive amateur work and from regional survey work, Rio Manu survey and the Terre settlement project, that we have this cluster of all newly established sites that were really sort of closely concentrated. And here you see just a 500 meters small transect, which has 3 sites on it. And these graphs are chronological profiles that show the sort of occupation of the times they were in use. And what's important here is that they all overlap in the sort of 3rd into the 2nd century. So it's that same time we're coming back here. This is really the time when it was at its busiest over there, most densely occupied, and that people were thriving, were doing really, really well, when that sort of 2-story house was built at the other farm. And that, of course, is a real contrast with what we saw at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻 here. And it is therefore my interpretation, my proposal, that what we're looking at here is the creation of not just a rural landscape, but also a specifically colonial landscape in which all or nearly all aspects of its inhabitants' lives play a role. Architecture, portable material culture, connections, burial customs, foodways, we all sort of see this happening, including agrarian production and agrarian practices, in fact. And you're looking here at a soil profile of a buried plough soil of an ancient agricultural field, which has yielded evidence, and we have several of these, of intensified agricultural practices, mostly to do with manuring and other agricultural techniques to reduce the fallow periods of the land so that much more frequent and larger and better crops could be produced. And it is with all this evidence coming together that we see that these newly founded sites, these single farms at Terre, all clustered together, they were thriving in the 3rd, 2nd century, while the long established community at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻 was dwindling, becoming smaller, inward looking. I should immediately add to this a few caveats, of course. Much more work would need to be done to really confirm that. But I think from the available evidence, that is what I sort of want to point to. And at this point, I also should draw some conclusions. I've highlighted here the terms domination and resilience to indicate that the rural communities that I've been speaking about at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻 and at Terre are not just a passive or a helpless object of colonial occupation and colonial exploitation. They do, and they did have their own agency. And we see that very well at 𝐒'𝐷𝐻 especially in the 6th to 4th centuries. That is the sort of the situation of Area F. Because at that time, the community, sort of, to all intents and purposes, became Punic, whatever that means, however we want to understand that. But they, most of all, they continued to do well. They were thriving at that time, and they stuck at the same time to many of its local roots. They adopted many new things, they were innovative, but they also sort of kept doing some things that they had been doing for many centuries. And you should also assume that perhaps they were doing so well because 𝐒'Zuraghi was not any place to begin with. It's sort of the largest nuraghi. It was a prominent and dominant place from the Iron Age onwards, of course. And so rural inequalities within rural society are not surprising in itself. And that, that's at 𝐒'Zuraghi people are not doing so well, that at Terre they're much better off. That in itself is not surprising. That's sort of nothing new. And here we see that illustrated with these photos that give us similar situations in the more recent past of Sardinia. But even so, the different trajectories of the communities living in the Terre district and at 𝐒'Zuraghi are remarkable. And I do want to venture, therefore, the thesis that Carthaginian colonial rule did change things in the longer run, and favoring the newly established settlements and community at the detriment of the older, longer running one. But it wasn't the occupation, the Carthaginian occupation, Carthaginian Punic wars, if they happened at all, in the mid or late 6th century BCE. It was much later, centuries later. And it was much more gradual, therefore, that old power structures, that old elites, and elites I want to use, that's why as I've put that miniature nuraghi there, it was much later that old elites lost their way, lost their role, they were sidelined. But by the 3rd century BCE, it was the people in the Terre district really who were doing well and who had the upper hand. And again, I want to emphasize here, I think I want to present this as an initial thesis, and I think it's a starting point to work with. What we definitely need is much more work, survey and excavation of such rural contexts. My end point, really, my end slide here is by noting that rural life, though, is not only about agricultural production and about rural power, about rural economy. Rural roots run deep. And that I want to demonstrate with the latest phase at 𝐒'Zuraghi, even though that phase has been very poorly preserved. In fact, this is a phase which sort of dates to the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, on top of the nuraghe, for which we assume and think that we have evidence for a possible shrine on top of the nuraghe. And incense burners, about 2 dozen or so that we have, like this one, come from there. The use of a by then abandoned nuraghe fits a much wider picture of rural communities in Sardinia, particularly in Western Sardinia, engaging with monumental remains in the countryside. This is a relatively late phenomenon, and so the chronology sort of fits well there. And we actually I showed you 𝐒'Z𝐲 with that inscription when I started. That actually shows you precisely what was going on. Even if people were no longer living there, they suddenly knew these nuraghi and were making some sort of use of this. And it's also very interesting that the other slide in the corner, where you see a couple of stairs and a hole, there's a well, stairs leading down a well, which is nuraghic as well, had been abandoned. And in the 2nd, 1st century BCE, it was reused for Punic ritual purposes. And this is right on the edge of the cluster of rural settlements at Terre. So even there, those people who got there, they sort of were doing things with those older remains in the landscape. So rural roots continue to run deep in the countryside, or to be picked up and reworked and reimagined. And with that, I want to end emphasizing that archaeology, of course, is teamwork. Many colleagues, students, friends, local school students have joined us at 𝐒'Zuraghi, working with us, and at Terre as well previously. The University of Valencia has been a key partner for 2 decades working here in this part of Sardinia. And most of all, of course, the local communities in Terre and 𝐿, the commune of 𝐿, who's crucial for the work that we've been doing. And our team here, the core members of our team, this is the 2019 season shown in the garden of the museum. But the little other photo there are mug shots from last summer when the pandemic kept us home in Italy, Spain, the US, where we did a virtual writing campaign that has been crucial for pulling together the mountains of evidence from the ditch in particular, which we are working hard to prepare for publication, hopefully later this year. Thank you for your attention.
Great, Peter. It's really extremely interesting, your presentation. So, of course, you should now imagine that there are 8 or 9 people clapping their hands, which is a little bit different online
in that case.
But no, really, this is really fascinating. And indeed, very close also to many of the research projects of the KNIR itself. So really, so of course, after applause, discussion follows. Now we have this system that in the lower toolbar of your Zoom window, you can go to the icon most to the right, which is called reactions. If you click it, you can raise your hand. So perhaps this is the best way to organize our discussion. I will then, I can see perhaps you as well, who has already put up their hand, and I can unmute them, and then we have a decent discussion in this way, I hope. Okay, I already see one question coming up. 𝐒𝐵𝐺𝐵𝐿, you want to answer a question?
Hi, Peter. Hi, Tessa. Thank you very much, Peter, for this wonderful talk. Every time I'm impressed with all the new data that you are presenting to us. I thought perhaps to open the discussion, I would like to ask about the colonial framework in which you present this whole data set, the whole story, because I have some questions about if this is really the appropriate discourse in which to frame and also to which you connect all these developments. So there are 2 moments in which this colonial aspects comes through. This is, for example, in the 3rd century, when you talk about this colonial landscape that develops, which somehow suggests that the colonial power of the moment, Rome, is the responsible agent for this development. While of course we know that a lot of these developments happen in other areas totally unconnected to, let's say, direct colonial influence. And in some way it also detaches this transformation from the people who are undergoing this trend, as if this is the result of a foreign colonial power, while it could also be connected to other and even indigenous development. So is this really a colonial landscape, or is this ruralization part of an entirely different development? So that is one, and this also holds true for the first colonial phase you talk about in the 7th century, when you connect it to the Phoenician world. Is it really, do we really have to envisage this context as a colonial context, in the sense that we have a colonial power trying to dominate these regions? Or are we using here a very loose category of colonization, and do we really have to use this term, or are other terms actually better suitable for this context studies?
Thank you, Jeremia. That's a great question, and also sort of a great opportunity to be clearer about some of those aspects. I think sort of on the one hand, yes, I've been using the term sort of loosely because for lack of time, and sort of it's already, I think I sort of crammed quite a bit of stuff into this talk, so sort of I couldn't be more precise. But sort of to turn to that sort of the thriving of the Terre community, I think that has a colonial connotation, but I did not intend, at least, to connect that to Roman colonial presence. And sort of, I see that in as a long-term development that sort of still comes out of the Carthaginian colonial presence. Sort of, so Carthage becomes the, we know very little about how those colonial formal state political mechanisms need to work. There's sort of, even about tax raises and all of that, there's some vague comments about it, but we do see that in that time there's a lot of new settlement, and I didn't go into, and it remains difficult to talk about whether the farms in Terre, whether they represent new people coming in, migrants, and that's reason. I think that's a very reasonable hypothesis, certainly in the light of recent ancient DNA work, not in Terre, but sort of a little bit more, but that's very vague at the moment. But so I think it's regarding to this later period, it's a little bit of both. This is, yes, I think that the term colonial helps because it's a new landscape that's being created, but the 3rd, 2nd century landscape is not created because of, at the end of the 3rd century, Rome takes over. That has nothing to do with it. In fact, sort of, I think that development shows the irrelevance of Roman power on the ground in the countryside at that time. What it is the older Carthaginian colonial situation still playing out through time. Sort of, almost, if you would think in Brodelian rhythms, it's sort of the rhythm that sort of was set in motion much earlier, and that still sort of plays out sort of a time later, even though historical Rome coming in happens, but it really doesn't have much of an impact. That comes another 100-200 years later. And about the earlier Phoenician period, no, I don't think that the Phoenician period is colonial at all. It's sort of, we use the term Phoenician colony, but if you look at it in terms of, that's why I use the term expansion. We have, there's Phoenicians, there's people coming from the Levant, but also from Spain. And they establish themselves, and we have good evidence. And that's one of the exciting things. There's now 3 sites in Sardinia where there's communities, people living long-term in nuragic settlements, 𝐿𝐵𝐵𝐴 in the north, 𝐒'𝐔𝐫𝐚𝐿 in the center, and nuraghi 𝐒𝐵𝐴 in the south. And 𝐿𝐵𝐵𝐴 is earlier, is 9th, 8th century, but both 𝐒'𝐵𝐴 and 𝐒𝐵𝐴 are 7th, 6th century. And but that's not colonial. That's just the term colonial is there of convention. So it's cultural interaction, I think, that sort of term.
Thank you. Yeah,
thank you, Peter. Julia, I think we move first to a next question, if that's okay for you. And Angelo Castellaro, I will try to unmute you. Could you also put on your camera? Oh, yes, you did. Thank you.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this presentation. And I'm sorry because I'm not an expert of this historical period. So I have some remarks from another perspective. I'm working on this transition between Byzantine and Islamic period in Sicily. And so I think that these remarks on colonization, expansion, and reaction and resilience of local community, it's very interesting also for the topic that I'm working in Sicily. And I think that this post-colonial perspective to try also to read the history of the rural society going beyond this just succession of rulers, and include in this long-term history the rule of local communities. I think that is very, very important for rethinking the historical framework of Sicily or Sardinia, not just with succession of Carthaginian, Romans, Byzantine, etc., and Sicily, Muslim, Normans, etc. I think that your approach is very interesting, and I have just remarks on which is the much more strong archaeological indicator of the reaction of local communities to the big picture of changes in rulers. I think that's if you say some words about that, and just little remarks about if you found in your nuraghi occupation of late antiquity periods and Byzantine period, because for example we know that in other nuraghi in Sardinia there is this phenomena that's abandoned nuraghi was occupied, for example, for burials in especially in between the 5th and 8th century AD. And I was curious if you, in your case, you found also this later evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Anton.
Thank you for your comments and question. To begin with the last part, that's the easy part of your question. No, we don't have anything Byzantine or sort of not even really imperial Rome. We think that there was something perhaps 1st century AD, well, CE, perhaps 2nd century, this sort of shrine on top of the nuraghe, but that was when there was no settlement going on. And we don't have good evidence from the top because the top of the nuraghe has been used over the recent centuries, has been removed by local people to reuse stones and other things from top of there. So whatever was there has been destroyed. But it is assumed that the community of 𝐿 sort of had a successor in the current village of 𝐿, which has a 9th century church, or at least a church that's set to go back to the 9th century. And there's some late Roman and Byzantine material coming from, well, not even an emergency excavation, just some material that was collected during works. But that's not substantial. So it looks like, and Nuraghi and the village are only a kilometer or so apart. So it looks like people sort of moved from one place to the other. But there's nearby the nuraghe 𝐒'𝐫𝐚𝐿 in Midis, where the University of Sassari, Giorgio Spanu and others are working. And that has a clear late Roman and Byzantine phase. About the first part of your question, so when you mean the reaction of the rural community, do you mean the contemporary rural community or in the past?
No, in the past. I'm looking because, for example, now in Sicily, for example, there is these debates of the impact of the Islamic rulers that changing a lot. But I was wondering if it's possible in some cases to find, because it's very difficult to find the archaeological indicator of the reaction of local community in this change in ruling, in changes in ruling agents.
Yeah, I don't think, well, I think that's a question that's almost impossible to answer, in the sense that I find it hard to imagine to think about a specific clear indicator. It really sort of is, in a way, what are you looking for? Are you looking for, say, think of the area F that I spoke about, these Punic houses outside the nuraghe. It looks like the people there they were sort of living totally Punic lives, if you want. Is that an indication of a heavy impact, that they become Punicized, if you want to use that term, which I wouldn't normally do? Or would you say, as I was trying to do here, people are actually really well off? They were still in contact with the entire West Mediterranean, getting imports, being able to build large houses. So they were living good lives. And, you know, we need to look, when we go further, at the environmental evidence, if you can see what they were eating and all of that. But I would think, you know, it's kind of, do we want to emphasize the identity? They lost their nuragic identity, became Punic, and that was a sort of a big impact? Or would they say, well, these people are actually very resilient. They were able to find their way. They took what they liked, or they took what they had to, but still they were well off. They were not impoverished. And I think these are the sort of terms that I think much more helpful to think about that question. But it's not a straightforward answer to your question, so I'm sorry.
No, but I know that there is not just an answer, that's a complicated matter, but I think that is very interesting to compare these same phenomena in other different frame time, because this relationship with changes in ruling the landscape and new rulers that's coming continuously in the history of Mediterranean, it's interesting that from an archaeological point of view to have a dialogue between different historical period and moving also beyond the medieval period and also in the post-medieval period. I think that's your
sorry.
So thank you.
I have
Absolutely,
to
thank you.
we are we still have other questions to answer. 𝐒'𝐤𝐴𝐥𝐫𝐚𝐥, I'm trying to unmute you now. Yes.
Yes. Hi, Peter. Indeed a pity that you can't be here with us in Rome right now. But thank you very much for this lecture. I was wondering, somewhat related to what Angelo was asking, because you've shown us the new Punic farmsteads a bit further away from the nuraghe. But do we have any information, any evidence from rural settlements in the direct hinterland of the nuraghe? Is there a complete emptiness, or?
No, close to 𝐒'𝐤𝐴𝐥𝐫𝐚𝐥, you mean?
Yes.
Well, yes, well, that's what I was, again, sort of very briefly, very elliptically referring to as the need of more research, because I'm very well aware I'm talking about two sites that are, you know, still sort of 80 kilometers apart, and sort of to draw all conclusions from there is perhaps a little bit risky. But at the same, so therefore I'm not insisting to say that it is the all and the answer to it, but so I'm presenting it more as a hypothesis, if you want, sort of from which to work with. And so, yeah, one of the things that needs to be done is a systematic survey in that upper area, and there's work underway at the moment. So it's a team from both from Texas now. So these are former 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐥𝐵𝐚 graduates, Linda Gosner and Jessica Noel, based in San Antonio and Texas Tech University, who are started a survey sort of around 𝐒'𝐤𝐴𝐥𝐵𝐚 from there to the coast. And the idea is also to go a little bit more towards sort of down the 𝐬𝐮𝐵𝐻 towards Monte Carlo, precisely that area. But they had a pilot survey and they did one serious season, and then the pandemic hit. So, well, you must be familiar with that, the consequences. So, but sort of we had, I had organized a session at the AIA, the American Institute of Archaeology annual meeting a year ago. Was it last? Yeah, I think it was. Yeah, it was not this January, but the other January, which was comparing, because there's a couple of new surveys in the Punic world being carried out, and to compare results. There's another survey, also 𝐒𝐿𝐴𝐥𝐵𝐚 graduates, Tom Leppert and Elizabeth Murphy, who are working around Panilouriga. And it's interesting, around Panilouriga, they do find similar farmsteads, these sort of colonial style, totally sort of Punic style architecturally farmsteads. Linda and Jess are not finding this sort of thing around, at least, you know, so far, around 𝐒'𝐤𝐴𝐥𝐵𝐚, but which still means there's lots of Punic material around, but it tends to be associated with nuraghi. So it is different, those two areas. And it is, and then this is something, you know, the settlement pattern around Terre, that was Carlos and I, Carlos Gomez Bejar and I, when we wrote our Rural Landscapes of the Punic World, and published in 2008, well, a long time ago. It's the sort of this dense cluster of rural sites in Terre. It's interesting that there's now similar things being found around Panilouriga, but there's perhaps a little bit of it sort of close to Nora, but otherwise that is more exception than rule, it seems. And so it is much of the Punic period settlement pattern elsewhere in Sardinia or southern Sardinia is tightly associated with nuraghi, sort of much. So in that sense, the situation at 𝐒'𝐤𝐴𝐥𝐵𝐚 is probably more representative in broad terms. You know, I can't speak about the details of it.
And rural settlement predating the Punic colonization?
In other external sort of, no, there's no sort of, these farms are all from the very end of the 5th century. Earliest is the very end of the 5th century. There's I think there's 140 sites in Terre that are known, and I think there's 5 or 6 of them that have yielded a few surface finds that are probably older. but these are a few surface finds, not systematically. In the systematic survey, we have not found anything earlier than the 4th century. And it is only in nuraghe, it's within a kilometer of the settlement, the colonial settlement itself, that there's an early sort of 7th, 6th century site being found. So these are sort of more, how do you say, sort of, they're still in the immediate periphery of the colonial settlements.
Thank you. It's a nice setting you are in, Rogier. It looks like a nice laboratory.
Yes, I'm presenting the new archaeology lab at the KNIR.
Excellent. Okay, I would like to give the floor to Marleen. Yes, you are.
Yes, thank you very much, Tessa, and thank you very much, Peter, for a great talk. And I have to say, I really enjoyed just watching the excavation photos and, the summary pictures from Italy, where I wish I could be at the moment. And I have a question, which I guess is somehow related to Jeremiah's. So I was really interested to see how your reconstruction of what is happening in 𝐒'𝐷𝐷𝐻, it kind of, problematizes, I suppose, this general image of a phase of Phoenician trade, and then you get a phase of Punic colonization that very much goes hand in hand with exploitation. Mm-hmm. And then I was still wondering, because in the way you then explained this more colonial landscape in the 3rd century, I think during your talk, you were talking about the gradual collapse of local elites. In your answer to Jeremiah, you were talking about Brodelian rhythms, and this is just something that happens. And perhaps slightly playing the devil's advocate there, wouldn't it be possible that this is just the moment that a more sort of active colonial policy from Carthage is being established, and that might explain this kind of new colonial landscape? And the reason I am also thinking in this direction is, on the one hand, because I think, at least in the material you showed us from 𝐒'𝐷𝐷𝐻, not much is happening there in the 3rd century. So it really, these two developments, as you also showed, are sort of interrelated. And also from what I know, and I have to admit that it's not that much, but from the Terre material, there you have like quite a lot of coinage there, which you also showed in your slides. Yeah. And it's all coinage coming from Sicily. It's Carthaginian production. So there does seem to be a sort of very active involvement, at least coming from Carthage right in the 3rd century.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of that close connection with Carthage is definitely there, and that's very visible in the Terre area, and not so much in the at 𝐒'𝐷𝐷𝐻. Although I must say, sort of the problem with the later phase, so the sort of late Punic, 1st, 2nd century, is that the sort of cleaning of the outer wall by Liliu in 1948. That sort of has not left much of that phase intact, and we've only got it in that area D. And because all the finds and all the documentation from Liliu have been lost, so it's hard to be very specific about it. But we have at area D, sort of, you have a fair bit of it, and so yeah, it's sort of. It looks very much like stuff, the kind of material we know from Terre, but it misses the sort of the variety and the richness which sort of is added to it only even just if you think of the architecture alone. And yes, that connection with Carthage was clearly there. It's also historical sources. In fact, there is in 215, there's a rebellion, famous rebellion in Sardinia, led by a local Punic landowner, and at that time there are, which is right in the middle of the second the Punic Wars, and there are embassies being sent from Carthage to Sardinia, or the Sardinian elites they are managed to get to Carthage, and that, so that's anecdotal historical evidence, but yeah, the connection was there. But to what extent you need to see that as, or you can see that as a colonial power, sort of, as a spider from its web trying to organize things sort of at a distance. I think there's the complication of of distance and how to mobilize sort of people at such a distance as well. A colonial power can send armies, and in fact, during that rebellion, that's what the Carthaginians tried to do. They tried to send a fleet over from Ibiza, which then, according to Livy, got lost in a storm. But it's more, I think, at that level to really mobilize the local people. That's we don't see. There's no evidence of any. Although even that battle where 𝐒'𝐵𝐷𝐼 and so on lost, there's no evidence of any military conflict that would have been somewhere between, well, the Campidano and 𝐬𝐵𝐷𝐼, somewhere in that area. You just do not see that in the archaeological evidence.
And could it, I mean, not necessarily seeing it as sort of this, well, as you call it, this spider, this huge imperial power that sort of imposes this new system, but rather as Carthage just having a higher demand for agricultural produce, which is then sort of answered to from the Sardinian countryside in a way.
Yes, but there the complication is what Jeremiah already referred to, the Roman intervention. Rome takes over in 237, so at the late 3rd century already. So in that sense, that area is already nominally or politically Roman, although culturally it remains entirely Punic.
Yeah, and I do think that, at least, again, I'm mostly familiar with the coinage evidence, but then in the 2nd century, that actually becomes much less. So it's much less sort of involved in Mediterranean business in the Roman period, in a way.
Yeah. No, and there's definitely, at least historically, there's this Carthage was sort of not happy. Carthaginians were not happy to lose Sardinia and other places, and so they did try. So they must have tried, but I don't know to what. It's very, very likely, very possible that it sort of played a role, but I don't think that's enough to really show what we're really looking at, the kind of developments, because it's about food waste. People preferring to eat beef and that becoming less. It's pork consumption is actually remarkably low, and that sort of only takes off in the Roman period if we go from elsewhere published material. So it's really in that sense slower rhythms, but but as you were quoting me there, I think I should I did use that term, of course, the Brodelian rhythms, but that's in no way to sort of suggest that those communities had no agency in those matters. They were doing things, but sort of, it just didn't show overnight, didn't go overnight.
Okay, thank you, Marleen. I'm going to mute you. Last question or perhaps the second last question for Alessandro Bonzetti.
Hi, Peter. I'm very happy to have seen you and this wonderful seminar, but I wanted to ask you, well, obviously we can go on talking and discussing what we deem relevant for a harder or a softer colonial impact. This is a long discussion that can take a whole day. But the point for me is, what about the beginning of your situation? Because as you said, we generally figure that the nuraghi are Bronze Age or maybe even Iron Age in their transformations, but we never saw, and data obviously are lacking somehow, an idea of an antemurale built in the 7th century. And we generally don't see perfectly circular antemurale with the so well spaced towers. So this is absolutely peculiar. And when you look at the distribution of the nuraghi around the Souraki, you see that this monster nuraghe is absolutely not totally isolated, but it is in a rather empty area. So when we worked on the distribution of nuraghi, we always wondered that the Souraki could be something a little bit different. What do you think? Because yes, you are still lacking the data from inside, but you have more and more data that point to something a little bit different from the general narrative by nuraghi.
Yeah. Well, I would think, well, thank you very much. That's a great question. Well, I would want to say immediately, not a little bit. I think it's sort of pretty different. It's very different. And yeah, I think I remember now. Sort of, you used I think either you wrote or somebody else mentioned. So yeah, you know, when you and others studied with Alessandro and others, Alessandro 𝐒'𝐲𝐻, the distribution sort of nuraghi in that part there. Yes, nuraghi is exceptional, and unfortunately, of the older periods, we have no indication. It is only. No, it's not even sporadic. Well, yeah, there's sporadic material. There may be a sort of I think a late Neolithic shirt, or a shirt that's possibly late Neolithic sort of popped up somewhere, but that's no. We have quite a bit of obsidian, which still needs to be looked at in some cases, which is good in context. And we had somebody looking at it initially, but even that looks sort of later, and sort of it's an unusual working, or it could have been Riporto brought in from elsewhere or so. The oldest that we have is really so far the photo that I showed you, the basis, the foundation of the nuraghe, which stands on virgin soil. And what it has, the building material, we've got about 100, 200, 300, I don't know. So details of fragments, very sharp, flat fragments of basalt that come off when the blocks were put in place, and they were sort of, the size was adapted to sort of to keep them. Those fell probably on the ramp that was built to pull up the blocks, and when all that was removed, all that sort of was condensed into a fill that hid the lower two stone courses of the wall, because they protrude a little bit. And there's really nothing older in there. And so the dating of that is based on, as I said, we have nuragic material. And as you know, much nuragic material is poorly datable because it's sort of Bronze Iron Age, but whatever nuragic material that is more precisely datable is really Second Iron Age, sort of all the material that we have there. Then there's a bit of Phoenician, and then we have 2 C14 dates on bone from those contacts, or 3 from those contacts, and they all come together in this date, which it's, you know, we've been looking at it for quite a while, but there's nothing else we can make from it. From the nuraghe from inside, we haven't even begun to work on it, because it's just, that's another project. It's very expensive. That's just not what we're doing right now. We are going to, together with a geophysicist from Padova, Rita Deana, we're trying to do some more geophysical work, try for the makeup of the nuraghe, but that's not going to give us any date. So no, so, you know, so far for the nuraghe that's inside the Antemurale there, we just have to assume it's Bronze Age like the rest, but
who knows?
Who knows exactly?
Thank you. I'm afraid we have to stop the discussion. We are, for very good reasons, running late. I would like to thank Peter again. It's really, we're very grateful that at least in this way you can be here. And of course, we're looking forward to better times when you can actually physically come and join us for the discussion under some nice rinfresco and other things. But we keep that for another time. I want to thank everyone, also the very large audience, for the excellent discussion as well. And then I would also like to thank the technical assistants who have been working for us in the background to make this all work. So yes, indeed, we look forward to see you at the next KNIR dialogue. And I would say, yes, have a good evening, and keep thinking about colonial landscapes.
Well, thank you again, sort of from my end, very much. It's always a great opportunity to speak, and sort of was a great, sort of very mixed, very audience. So it's a great opportunity to be able to present our research here. So thank you, and saluti a Roma.
Yes, we will. Buona serata.